heat and other environmental stressors. Finally, the search for situational conditions causing or promoting violence has considered hot temperature as an environmental factor that affects human behavior. This research is based on the so-called heat hypothesis, which states that uncomfortably high temperatures increase aggressive behavior. Since the late 1800s, scientists have observed that aggression levels vary as a function of temperature, being higher at hot than at comfortable temperatures. The finding that exposure to high temperatures promotes aggression can be explained with reference to Berkowitz's 1993 cognitive neo-associationist model of affective aggression described in Chapter 2. Uncomfortably high temperatures represent aversive stimuli that activate aggression-related thoughts and feelings, giving rise to aggressive behavior. Drawing on the general aggression model, Anderson proposed that heat-induced discomfort may increase hostile affect and prime aggressive cognitions, both of which increase the likelihood of an aggressive response in social interactions that occur under aversively hot conditions. Heat hypothesis that aggression increases with higher temperatures. 3 methodological approaches have been developed for studying the temperature-aggression link. The first is the geographic regions approach, which seeks support for the heat hypothesis by showing that aggression is more prevalent in geographic regions with hotter as compared with cooler climates. The second is the time periods approach, which examines variations in the level of aggression as a function of temperature changes within a region over time, seasons, months, or times of day. Both the geographic regions approach and the time periods approach rely heavily on archival data, in particular meteorological records and crime statistics, to examine the link between high temperatures and aggression. Finally, research based on the concomitant heat approach manipulates temperature in the laboratory and examines differences in aggressive behavior in relation to variations in temperature. Geographic regions approach, method for testing the heat hypothesis by comparing violence rates in cooler and hotter climates. Time periods approach, method for testing the heat hypothesis by comparing violence rates in the same region during cooler and hotter periods. Concomitant heat approach, method for testing the heat hypothesis by manipulating room temperature and observing covariations between temperature and aggressive behavior. Across different methodological approaches, the meta-analysis of 55 studies by Burke et al. 2015 found significant positive associations between high temperature and both interpersonal and intergroup violence. With every increase of 1 standard deviation on the temperature scale, the relative risk of violent conflict was found to increase by 2.1% for interpersonal and 11.3% for intergroup conflict. Empirical evidence for the heat hypothesis. Studies based on the geographic regions approach mostly compared northern and southern areas of the U.S. They showed with high consistency that, as predicted by the heat hypothesis, violent crime is more widespread in the hotter regions of the South than in the cooler regions of the North. However, this observation is merely correlational and tells us little about any causal influence of temperature on aggression. Variations in geographical location are associated with a host of other social structural variables that could be responsible, solely or in part, for observed regional differences in aggression. When controlling for a range of these variables, such as population size, ethnic composition, unemployment rate, educational background, and age composition, the link between temperature and violent crime remained significant across a range of studies. Anderson et al. 2000. However, the heat hypothesis is only one of several explanations for the higher rate of violent crime in the southern regions of the U.S. An alternative explanation was proposed by Nisbet in 1993. He argued that higher rates of violent crime in the South result from a particular Southern culture of honor, which can be traced back to the historical roots of settlement and survival in the southern part of the country. The Southern culture of honor is characterized by a greater acceptance of the use of violence, both for self-protection and in response to an insult or provocation as a way of restoring one's honor. Nisbet reported that Southerners showed greater anger in response to a provocation and were more likely to produce aggressive solutions to an interpersonal conflict following a provocation. Similarly, D. Cohen et al. 1996 showed that, following an insult, Southerners were more upset and more likely to engage in aggressive behavior than Northerners. A limitation of the geographic regions approach is that it examines the temperature-aggression link at a highly aggregated level, i.e., at the level of entire regions and large populations. Therefore, it does not yield insights into the link between exposure to high temperature and aggression within the individual person, as conceptualized in the heat hypothesis. On the other hand, it is a strength of geographic regions studies that they can draw on large and reliable data sets about the criterion variable, i.e., violent crime. Murder and assault rates, for example, are reported and recorded continuously over time. Therefore, geographic region studies are able to complement evidence from other sources in evaluating the heat hypothesis. Figure 5.5, variations in assault rates over the course of the year aggregated across 7 data sets. On the y-axis is assault rate, percentage of yearly total, from 6 to 10% over the months of the year. Oh wow, yeah, so it's a lot higher in like June, July, August, September. It's almost like a normal curve, and the lowest in January and December. Well, time period studies examines variations in aggression over different periods of time within the same region, and are therefore less affected by the confounding influence of socio-structural variables. This approach also supports the heat hypothesis by showing that violent crime rates are higher in the summer months than during the winter period, and the crime rates are higher in hotter than in cooler summers. Anderson, 2001. For example, the rates of murder, assault, and rape were found to be highest in the summer months across several studies, and the daily rates of emergency calls to police stations were found to increase as temperatures went up. Figure 5.5 illustrates the distribution of assault cases over the year course based on Anderson's 1989 aggregation of data across 7 large data sets accumulated between 1883 and 1977. As predicted by the heat hypothesis, Figure 5.5 shows a clear peak of assault rates in the summer months. Comparing years with different average temperatures and with hotter versus cooler summers, Anderson et al. 1997, found further support for the heat hypothesis and the particular impact of heat on effective aggression. Both homicide and serious assault were more prevalent in hotter years and hotter summers, but property-related crime was unaffected by variations in temperature. In addition to these studies from the U.S., support for a link between temperature oscillation and the rate of armed political conflict within tropical regions has been provided by Hsang et al. 2011. They analyzed rates of armed conflict in El Niño years with higher temperatures and in La Nina years with lower temperatures between 1950 and 2004, and found significantly higher rates of armed conflict in the warmer periods of the El Niño years in the regions affected by El Niño-La Nina oscillations. Critics of the time period's approach have argued that rather than reflecting a causal effect of the aversive effects of high temperatures, the increase in violence could be explained by differences in people's routine activities. People tend to spend more time outdoors in the summer months and in years with hotter as opposed to cooler summers. This may create more opportunities for aggressive encounters with others, leading to higher rates of violent crime. Anderson, 1989, argued against this interpretation by pointing out that rates of domestic violence are also higher in the summer months, although families typically spend more time at home together in the winter months. Looking at the covariation of temperature and aggression within the context of baseball matches, in which the opportunities for aggression are standardized across matches, higher temperatures interacted with in-game provocation to predict aggressive moves. When provocation was high, as defined by the number of times a teammate had been hit with a ball by a member of the opposing team. The rate of aggressive retaliation increased significantly in proportion to the temperature during the match. The third approach addressing the heat hypothesis is the concomitant heat paradigm. It involves manipulating temperature levels in laboratory settings and observing variations in aggressive behavior as a function of variations in temperature. Here, intra-individual associations are observed between exposure to heat and aggressive behavior using very different behavioral criteria of aggression, mostly electric shocks, to the other two paradigms. The concomitant heat approach is illustrated by a study by Vridge et al. 1994, who showed a sample of police officers, a virtual reality display of a burglary, that involved a face-to-face confrontation of the police officer with the suspected burglar. The participants were asked to respond to the incident as they would do in real life in their job, using laser beams as simulated weapons. During the experiment, the room temperature was systematically varied. One group was exposed to a comfortable temperature at 21 degrees C, and the other was tested in an uncomfortably hot room at 27 degrees C. The main dependent measures were ratings of the negative affect elicited by the confrontation with the burglar, perceptions of the burglar as aggressive, perceived threat from the burglar, and estimated likelihood to shoot. All four dependent variables showed a significant effect of room temperature, supporting the heat hypothesis. Participants tested at an uncomfortably hot room temperature perceived the suspected burglar as more aggressive, reported more negative affect, and perceived greater threat. In support of the heat hypothesis, they also indicated a higher likelihood that they would use their firearms against the suspect than participants who were tested at a comfortable room temperature. However, other laboratory studies found a curvilinear relationship between temperature and aggression, demonstrating a decrease in aggression with very high temperatures. On the basis of a meta-analysis of 11 studies, Anderson et al. 2000 concluded that the results of laboratory studies on the heat hypothesis had remained inconsistent. Evidence supporting the temperature-aggression link has, with very few exceptions, been limited to the aggression-enhancing effects of uncomfortably high temperatures. No corresponding effect has been found for uncomfortably low temperatures in natural settings. The explanation offered by Anderson et al. 2000 is that people are generally better equipped to protect themselves against the cold than they are to escape from excessive heat, so they are able to reduce cold-related discomfort more easily than heat-related discomfort. The implications of studies that support the heat hypothesis are worrying in the face of global warming. If increases in temperature are systematically related to increases in violent crime, then the continuous rise in global temperature represents a risk factor for the rise in violent crime. Miles, Novello, and Anderson, 2019, have proposed both direct and indirect paths by which higher temperatures may contribute to an increase in violence. Their model is shown in Figure 5.6. The immediate impact of rising temperatures on the individual is conceptualized on the basis of the general aggression model as the result of an aversive state that gives rise to irritability, anger, and negative arousal. In addition, indirect effects are expected via the negative impact of rising temperatures on macro-social changes, such as poverty as a result of bad harvests and economic instability, which are known risk factors for aggression at the individual, intergroup, and societal level. A study by Bartlett et al. 2020 found a positive correlation between temperature and extreme weather events, as well as a positive correlation between extreme weather events and homicide rate across the world. Figure 5.6, direct and indirect effects of rapid global warming on aggression and violence. So it's a flowchart. So this is from the Miles, Novello, and Anderson study. So you begin with global warming, which leads to increased heat, drought, extreme weather, sea level rise, and flooding, which leads both to direct heat effects, e.g. irritability, which leads to violent crime, intergroup violence, civil war, terrorism, and international war. And the increased heat, drought, extreme weather, sea level rise, and flooding also lead to failed crops, natural disasters, economic instability, poverty, and eco-migration, which leads to both violence-prone adults, prenatal and postnatal developmental problems, and to intergroup conflict, civil, political unrest, refugees and internally displaced persons, and resource competition. And those both lead to violent crime, intergroup violence, civil war, terrorism, and international war. Moreover, scarcity of food in hotter parts of the world may increase involuntary migration, which in turn is a source of intergroup conflict. The impact of rising temperatures on intergroup aggression and violence is also at the core of the climate, aggression, and self-control in humans model, CLASH. The model proposes that people in cooler climates with large seasonal variations in temperature need to adapt to this environmental challenge by engaging in more planning and self-control to ensure a sufficient supply of food. Both future orientation and self-control are inhibitors of aggressive behavior, which are not required to the same extent in cultures living in hotter climates with less seasonal variation. First evidence on the association between temperature and future orientation, as well as self-control, in line with the proposed model, is presented by Van Lang et al. 2018. The authors acknowledge, however, that climate is more than just temperature and that other variables, such as national wealth, religion, or political circumstances, may have an additive or interactive effect on heat-related aggression and conflict. Research on the heat hypothesis should alert both policymakers and the general public to the fact that the adverse effects of global warming are not restricted to our natural environment, but also pose a threat to the social functioning of human communities. At the same time, this line of research has important implications for violence prevention in the short term. As noted by Anderson et al. 2000, keeping temperatures at a comfortable level by means of air conditioning may help to bring down violence rates and may be particularly useful in settings such as prisons, workplaces, and schools where violence is a problem.